Welcome everyone to the KIX EMAP workshop on cross-national dashboards for accountability for gender equality in education. My name is Veronica Mosolova. I'm the project officer for the KIX EMAP Hub. As a technical host for this meeting, I will start with a short technical introduction before we begin the session. Before we start, please note that at this event, language interpretation is available in English, Arabic, and Russian. You can enable it at the bottom of the screen by clicking on the interpretation button. Уважаемые участники, как всегда, на нашем мероприятии доступен синхронный
перевод. Like always, you can listen to a simultaneous interpretation by choosing the channel at the bottom panel. If you need assistance, please write to us in the chat box.
العلم أن خلال الاجتماع سيكون هناك ترجمة فورية باللغة العربية والروسية بالرجاء الضغط على رمز الترجمة الفورية للوصول للقناة.
Thank you. Please note that due to the large room size, all microphones will be muted at this event. At the same time, we invite you to keep your cameras on if possible to create a friendlier and more engaging atmosphere at this event. Please know that this event is being recorded and the recordings will be made publicly available. To make sure speakers can address your questions correctly, we invite you to rename yourself. You can change your name by going to the participants window. Please write your full name and your organization or your country. We also wanted to take a moment to have a short introduction in the chat. Please write your full name, your country, and your organization in the chat. And you can also write your questions and any technical issues to us in the chat. You can write to the KIX EMAP team. You can ask your questions at any time during the session. Please write your full name and your country when you ask your question, to make sure that speakers can group the questions and address them at the Q&A sessions. You can also write your questions in Russian and Arabic. We have a team of translators who will translate your questions into English so that the speakers can address them. And please do not share any promotional messages or links in the chat without prior consent of the KIX EMAP Hub. If you want to stay in touch with us, we are active on social media. We have a Facebook page, we have a YouTube channel, and a channel on Twitter, X. You can find us at KIX EMAP, and by following our hashtags KIX EMAP and GPKIX that you see on the screen. On these channels, you can find all our latest activities, and the recording of this event will also be published on our YouTube channel. For more information, you can always visit our website, norag.org/KIXEMAP. And without further ado, I invite Marina Drove-Frotte, KIX EMAP Education Policy Evaluation and Learning Lead, to begin the event with the introductory remarks. Marina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to our workshop on cross-national dashboards for accountability for gender equality in education. This workshop is organized by the KIX EMAP Hub. Our hub is part of the Knowledge, Innovation and Exchange Program, which is a global partnership for education mechanism developed and implemented in collaboration with the International Development Research Center in Canada. KIX provides opportunities for applied research, knowledge sharing, and knowledge exchange on education priorities set by GPE partner countries. Our hub in particular is hosted by NORAG, the Global Education Center at the Geneva Graduate Institute. The hub serves 36 countries in the EMAP region, which is short for Europe, Middle East, North Africa, Asia, and Pacific. And our mission is to surface, amplify, and use research evidence for policy and planning in the EMAP region. And the workshop today is part of this mission. The use of data for improving gender equality in education is one of the priority thematic areas addressed by the Hub, and this workshop in particular builds on the demand received following the KIX EMAP webinar 14, Girls' Education Counting the Uncounted. And in that webinar, we had addressed how girls go missing in current global education data regimes and how research-based frameworks might be deployed to improve the situation. I hope you find the workshop today useful for your work and that you engage with both the instructors and your peers as we go along. But let me not take any more time from the instructors today. It's my pleasure to hand over the floor to Professor Elaine Unterhalter, who will kick us off in today's workshop. Elaine.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's absolutely amazing to be talking to people in so many different places and to be sharing the work we've been doing for about 5 years on the AGEE project. AGEE is Accountability for Gender Equality in Education. And what we're going to do in this work is talk about the work we have done as a team on cross-national dashboards for accountability for gender equality in education. Very aware that that relationship of cross-national dialogue has to connect with the many multiple contexts in which people work. And that's what we're so interested to hear from you and engage with you on sharing our work and hearing your comments on it. If we go to the next slide, I'll just briefly introduce the AGEE project to you. This project has been going since 2018, and it's a partnership between a range of universities, academics, organizations, and has as its central point this idea that gender equality in and through education and the data that supports it needs to connect with people's real experiences and people's reflections on those experiences. The data mustn't stand outside, it must be responsive to. And if we go to the next slide, I'll just briefly introduce the team at UCL who'll be working with me today to present our work to you. We're going to share the presentation. Dr. Rosie Pepin-Vaughan, Professor Kane Rolliston, and Dr. Helen Longlands. We all work together at UCL, but our AGEE project has got networks in a range of other universities, and we're just starting a new project with UNESCO, which we'll talk about in a minute. If we go to the next slide, I've set out on the slide our aims for the workshop. So we want to focus on the role of data in accountability for gender equality in and through education. And data sounds a scary word. It sounds a word very far away from experience, but that's one of the issues we want to draw out. We'll talk about the role of the AGEE project and the work we've done in constructing national dashboards and some of the data that comes from the cross-national data dashboard, and we'll highlight some of the issues of missing data and what that signals and what we think we can collectively together do about that. And then at the end, we want to draw out some of the organizational and methodological challenges in constructing national dashboards. If you were to pick up from some of the AGEE ideas and were to introduce them in your national contexts, what are some of the things we've learned from working with the AGEE dashboard in 2 countries in Africa, in Malawi and South Africa? And then we'll want to highlight some of the opportunities for dialogue and collaboration moving forward, because there's so many so many people from so many contexts. I'm a bit overwhelmed at the interest in our work. let's go to the next slide. And what the next slide is raising, and we're going to now change to use the slides from the technical team, is we're very aware that gender is a controversial and contested and difficult concept. It means different things to different people in different places. So we just want to get a sense of all the people in the workshop, how you understand gender. So if you've got a phone, could you scan the QR code and tell us how you understand gender? And we're going to look at meanings in English, meanings in Russian, meanings in Arabic, see where our collective ideas group or gather. So could you scan the QR code now? Or if you don't want to join from your phone, you could go to the, through your browser, use the code that's at the top of the slide. I hope that's clear to everybody. Let me pause and see if that's okay. And we start to get answers coming in. Let's see where they're clustering. I guess we'll start with some of the English ones, which are identities starting to get big. Equality is emerging. That's interesting. The social construction's going down to the bottom. Oh no, it's coming up again, large. Okay, and I'm seeing love emerging as a very interesting new slant on it. Okay, social contracts, equality and identity are emerging as the biggest. Can I hand to Veronica for her interpretation of what's coming through in Russian?
Yes, sure. We have equality.
Equality coming
Also
through
in Arabic,
Russian.
equality.
Equality. That's very interesting. That oh, okay. Equality is also coming through quite strongly in English, but identity, which I guess is something more performed, is stronger in English. But okay, that's really interesting. I hope we can hold this as a set of ideas and maybe think about it in weeks to come, because while I'm going for the big ideas, the other smaller ideas might also merit comments. Veronica and Yasmina, are there any ideas that strike you in Arabic and Russian that we should also just keep bubbling in our minds?
Yes, actually, in Russian, we also have social construct and
Okay.
Identity, which is similar
Identity.
to the English concepts that we see on the screen.
And Yasmina,
Also in Arabic, we have diversity in natural system.
Interesting as well. Okay. So lots
And
to
a
think about.
partner,
Sorry, Yasmina, go
partner
on.
in constructing the universe.
Okay.
In constructing the universe.
Okay, so the abstract, both the abstract and the connection to the concrete are coming through in Arabic, which is also very interesting. Okay, so those are the ideas in our everyday conversation and the kind of the concept we're working with, the things we're thinking with. I want to move more to the next slide where we're looking for participation. and we're thinking about work, the education organization you work in, we've got 4 different meanings. So think in your work organization, its policies and its structures. What are the ways in which gender is used in that work in education? And you can vote for all 4. Is it different numbers of girls and boys accessing schooling, participation, and progression? If that's the main or the only thing, just vote for 1. If also at work, people talk about gendered relations of power and powerlessness, together or only with 1 and 2, vote for 2. Do people talk about in your work that gender might be different in the classroom, in the playground, for teachers in the staff room, for you as education administrators or people who work in NGOs? Or do you understand, or is gender understood as defending and taking forward equal rights in and through education? So just vote again using the QR code, and let's see how we're trying to put ideas about gender into practice in the settings in which we work. I know people are voting, maybe thinking, and we'll wait for the results to come through. And see. Okay, that's extremely interesting. So we're seeing that in the majority of workplaces, the access to schooling, participation and progression is a major concern, and that standing up for gender equality rights is a really important, but is not, it's not the front leader. That concerns with power and powerlessness are the minority of the organizations represented on this call, and that the way in which people might develop or engage with different gender identities is acknowledged, but it's not a major area. I think, you know, this is a rapid taking the temperature of who's on the call and what we're doing. But I think this distribution does represent where a whole nexus of concern on gender and education has gone. It's gone into access, it's gone into progression, it's gone into achievement. And there's been much less attention to looking at causes of unequal power and formations of powerlessness and how to address them. And I think that's one of the challenges we're going to have to look at in relation to the data, because I think the data is also going to represent that bar chart. If we go to the next slide, on the technical guide, we're interested in what measures your organization uses on gender and education. So these might be the monitoring and evaluation processes you use, whether or other data that is collected through censuses, or any data and measures you use. Could you just again use the Mentimeter, both from your phone or from the web, joining on the browser, and let's see what kind of measures are being collected. And again, we'll have I'll turn to Veronica and Yasmina for a percentage on okay, so we're getting a range of different data sources coming through in English, numbers, surveys, specific M&E tools, numbers of scholarship for girls, looking at learning performance. I must say, I thought learning performance and learning outcomes would be coming one of the one that a lot of people were mentioning. But we're seeing a range of different forms of measures, CPD, professional development, budget and spending, assessment tools. This is a very interesting slide for me because of the wide range of data that your organizations are using. Veronica, could you, is that the sense in Russian? And Yasmina, could you comment in Arabic? Is it mainly numbers or is it a very wide range of measures?
There are no responses in Russian so far, but there is one in Arabic. So Yasmina, if you could.
Yes, we have here educational performance.
Educational performance. All right. So I suppose what this slide shows me, and people responding in Russian might be adding in a minute. There's one more in Arabic, Yasmina, if you wanted to just tell us.
We have also enrollment rate of the education.
Okay. What it tells me is that there's a wide range of measures being used by organizations, but they're not well integrated with each other. And maybe they don't connect well enough with the meanings of gender we were seeing in the first word cloud, and indeed the ways in which organizations are working with gender. That the data that is being used is in a way the obvious data, but that we need to use data more critically to understand the relationships that are producing gender inequalities or sustaining them. And it's that the AGEE project was developed to try to help us understand. Rosie, if we go now to the slide, it's the one after the interactive process. Yes, sorry, let's go to the Q&A. Well, actually, I'd like to go to the next slide, Rosie, on the limits of gender parity, because gender parity is the major issue that has been the way in which data on gender has been organized. We've looked at girls and boys and counted them, looked at percentages. And what we haven't used data well enough, in my view, and when we set up the AGEE project, this is what we were thinking about, is that using data to think about gender inequalities, what caused them and what sustained them, we needed a more integrated way. On the next slide is these questions that I've posed in work I've done on the problem with gender parity as a measure of education access, quality, or concerns with different kinds of inequalities. Because gender parity, which is only counting girls as a proportion of boys, doesn't look at the many different ways in which gender inequality and the many different relationships and institutional formations and cultural formations and underlying structures that form those inequalities. So that gender parity and those measures that you were talking about might be necessary to describe something, but it's not sufficient, I think, to help us develop those processes of equality and moving towards change. And I think in organizations, the challenge of what we measure is a very political challenge. Are we only going to measure the things that work to maybe get children moving from one class to another? Or are we going to measure things that really matter about equality, about rights, about sustainability, and how we connect those two? And it's this aspect that we want to move to when we ask, how can we measure and how can we listen to a whole range of critical voices around the complexity in which people live and the difficulties in which they live in thinking about the measures. It was at this point that I just wanted, I know I skipped over the Q&A question, but I just wanted to turn to Russia to ask if there are any compelling questions, or let's me take 5 minutes now, and then I'll hand over to Helen, who will give a bit more background on the AGEE project. Russia.
Yeah, not yet, Elaine. No. Yeah, I mean, in the chat, nobody has asked a question yet.
Okay, thank you.
Proceed, and then on the way they can add more questions.
Thanks. I mean, we at the moment we're sort of setting up the problem, and I'm sure a lot more questions will come in relation to the as we describe the project, as we describe the framework. But I'm going to hand now to Helen, who's going to talk about the background to setting up the AGEE project and the work we've done together. Helen.
Thank you, Elaine, and hello, everybody. So the timing of the AGEE project has been very fruitful or fortuitous in terms of linking in with current and recent high-profile international and national level initiatives and campaigns linked with gender equality in education. And this slide is an attempt to illustrate some of the breadth of that international interest in this area. So the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda, which position gender equality as central to a number of the different goals and to the agenda itself, and particularly gender equality in education. Then we have the UN Women's Generation Equality Campaign, UNESCO's key focus on gender equality, the Paris Declaration on Gender Equality, the Gender at the Centre initiative, which is a global alliance of civil society and international organisations interested in gender responsive education sector planning. Then the Advancing Gender Equality campaign launched by the Canadian government. And then we've also included a more local level campaign, the #JustKnow campaign in South Africa against gender violence on university campuses. So that's just a kind of snapshot of some of the things that it links in with the AGEE work, the work of AGEE links into. Next slide, please, Rosie. So as Elaine briefly mentioned earlier, the AGEE project, the Accountability for Gender Equality in Education, is a partnership between universities in the UK, Malawi, South Africa, and a range of international organisations, including UNESCO and other UN agencies, bilateral donors and civil society, which has been working to develop an indicator framework for gender equality in education and building a community of practice of people working or interested in gender equality in education. And so the project started The seeds of it go back quite a long way, but the first workshop we held was in 2015. And then when we received the funding, we started the project in full in 2018. And the first phase ran from 2018 to 2021 and involved conducting a range of preliminary, conceptual and technical work, conducting literature reviews, discussions with UNESCO and the Global Education Monitoring Report, which is based at UNESCO, and then holding a range of participatory discussions and workshops and a series of interviews with a wide range of key stakeholders from government, academia and civil society in Malawi, South Africa and internationally, out of which we developed our draft AGEE framework, which we're going to show in just a minute, and our cross-national indicator dashboard. And this is where we started to more fully establish our ongoing community of practice around gender measurement and education. Then in phase 2, which ran from 2021 to 2023, we conducted further critical discussion and refined our AGEE framework in consultation with practitioners, policymakers and researchers. We launched our AGEE website and we developed our approach, or began to develop our approach, to selecting indicators for different iterations of the AGEE dashboard. And then phase 3, which began in 2023 but is still ongoing, has so far involved a lot of intensive work on developing criteria for selecting and shortlisting indicators, primarily for the AGEE cross-national dashboard in respect to each of the domains of the AGEE framework. But we have also held some national level discussions on potential criteria for choosing indicators for measuring gender equality in education. And during this phase, we have also begun work on the development of a composite indicator for use again at the cross-national level. And then phase 4, which has very recently begun, just at the beginning of this month, involves deepening our work in Malawi and working with UNESCO offices in Kenya and Indonesia to try and help address some of the disconnections between global, national and local data collection and analysis processes, auditing existing data, identifying missing data, and using participatory processes to consult on and trial the collection and analysis of new data. And we'll say a little bit more about that work later on, I think. Next slide, please, Rosie. Thank you. So the process of developing the AGEE framework, this is our AGEE framework here. So the process of developing this has been a multi-layered and collaborative process with various stages of consultation and refinement. So the AGEE framework sets out 6 distinct but interconnected domains through which to capture information about the relationships between individuals, institutions, and contexts. And in developing the AGEE framework, we have drawn on the capability approach, which is a normative multidimensional framework for conceptualizing equality and development, developed by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, along with other scholars. So by defining educational inequalities as inequalities of capabilities in and through education, we aim to have a measurement framework that includes dimensions of freedom. So not only resources and outcomes, but also information relating to opportunities, processes, and freedoms to participate in education, and then the role of institutions, norms, and values. So the 6 domains of the AGEE framework are, as shown here, resources, values, opportunities, participation in education, knowledge, understanding and skills, and outcomes. So resources relate to the goods and services required for a gender equitable education system, which include, for example, money, policy, schools, trained teachers, administrators, support workers, and other types of information. The value domain relates to information on norms. So, for example, provisions in constitutions or the World Values Survey on attitudes to gender in education. The opportunities domain relates to the policy context and the economic and social environment, so encompasses laws, national curricula, and ideas about kind of the policy context and how this is put into practice, and gendered aspects of the political, economic, geographic, and cultural and social environment, gender relations within educational institutions, and so on. Participation in education domain considers gender differences in the capability to participate in education and levels of participation and progression of girls and boys in all levels of education. So this, for example, would include looking at differences in participation in education by socioeconomic status, location, race, or ethnicity. The knowledge, understanding and skills domain includes learning across all areas of the curriculum, so not just literacy and numeracy, but also including values around rights, gender equality, and other forms of learning and teaching. Outcomes domain, and we understand this is understood in a very broad sense to include economic empowerment, political participation, and speaking out against gender-based violence. So by gathering information across all 6 of the AGEE domains, it is possible to provide a much richer picture of gender equality in education system than we've had before through focusing solely on the gender parity measures, as well as a range of forms of inequality and marginalisation. The AGEE framework is also designed to be flexible to context, so that it's possible to get a sense of levels of inequalities and capabilities across different locations and situations. So flexibility and responsiveness are very important because of the variability of data availability and issues across different regions and countries. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide, please, Rosie. So yes, as mentioned, by drawing on the capability approach, we have aimed to develop a framework based on a more theoretically grounded conceptualization of gender equality in education. And by combining this in-depth theoretical work with the in-depth consultations in Malawi, South Africa, and with international organizations, we identified those 6 domains for measuring gender inequalities in education. So there were previous versions of the AGEE framework, which we have refined through this process of participation. And then through a process of reviewing other accounts of creating dashboards and indices linked with either gender equality or gender equality in education, and through a further process of in-depth consultation, we have developed criteria for selecting indicators for the cross-national dashboard. And then finally, the selection of indicators for the cross-national dashboard has involved a process of mapping and auditing cross-national data sources that are available that relate both to the theoretical review as well as earlier consultations and also to the criteria for selection. Next slide, please, Lucy. Thank you. So there are other existing measures, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that attempt to capture information about gender and education. But these still rely on gender parity measures. So, for example, the World Inequality Database on Education, which we've kind of shown a little snapshot of here, has been developed by the Global Education Monitoring Report at UNESCO. And this aims to highlight education inequality within and across countries to inform policy design and public debate. So the focus of this database is on the education system and on enrolment, progression and attainment, and therefore still connects in with gender parity issues. And it doesn't capture gender inequalities within and through school. In contrast, the AGEE framework looks at issues beyond gender parity, as we've shown, and thus allows us to build a more complex picture of educational experiences and factors that affect and determine educational inequalities by gender. Next slide, please. And there are also some more complex measures of gender inequalities that have been developed outside the education sector and indicate sites where gender injustice and how it impacts on individuals needs to be examined. And here we've included the example of the UNDP's Gender Inequality Index. But this also has, and along with the other kind of frameworks around more complex understandings of gender inequalities, still have a limited focus on education. And so this is where the AGEE project can complement these frameworks as well. So for example, the gender inequality, the UNDP's Gender Inequality Index is designed to reflect inequality in achievement between men and women in 3 dimensions: reproductive health, empowerment, and the labour market. But in terms of education, it also relies on a measure of gender parity, looking at the proportion of adult females and males with at least secondary education. And so the AGEE framework, like the UNDP framework, is informed by a definition of equality based on the capability approach. But AGEE, in contrast to UNDP, focuses specifically on education and how gender relations and inequalities affect educational capabilities, freedoms, and opportunities. Next slide, please, Rosie. And so this diagram is an attempt to visualize the AGEE approach and the in-depth work that we're doing through the project around identifying, planning, and advocating for better data on gender equality in education to improve understanding of gender inequalities and measurement and monitoring processes. So we start from an underlying concern with groups who are excluded or marginalised in terms of gender and what data is missing. Then our work has involved consultations at the local, national and international level around what needs to be measured, but also what is missing. And we've been doing our own audits of what data is available and exploring other potential sources that haven't yet been used. And then we combine this, as kind of explained, with the theoretical work based on the capability approach around defining what gender equality in education is and how it might be measured. And then we have used this to build AGEE dashboards. At the moment, predominantly the AGEE cross-national dashboard, but our ongoing work around kind of national level dashboards as well. And hopefully also to help inform and build local level dashboards too. So while these dashboards can provide an evaluation of the level of gender equality in education in a country, they also highlight which data are missing, and so they can play an important role in advocacy for improving data. And ideally, this will lead to better data in the long run to better inform policy and practice, but also feeding back into the AGEE process to improve AGEE dashboards. Next slide, please, Rosie. And here we've created another visual to try the AGEE theory of change to attempt to depict the ways in which the AGEE framework can help build knowledge and understanding about issues and processes that deepen inequalities, those that maintain existing gender relations, and those that could contribute to transformative change. And again, the purpose is also to support accountability processes linked with gender equality and education. Thank you. That's my bit. Elaine, I don't know if you wanted a Q&A. Great. Elaine, I don't know if you'd like to lead on a Q&A.
Hello, Helen. We've got many interesting questions. I mean,
okay, great. I might need to enlist the help of other AGEE team members.
Yeah, we have. I mean, it seems that the interest is growing in the AGEE project from all the workshop participants. And we have a number of interesting questions here. I would start with this one from Strayank Han from Cambodia. She's asking, how will the dashboard inform policy decisions related to gender equality in education and ensure no one is left behind? Can it highlight areas for targeted interventions? So that's the first question. So would you like to have a first question and then answer, or have all the questions and then answer one go?
I think maybe take them in turn, shall we, Elaine? Or...
Yeah, okay. Helen, do you want me to start with that one, and then you could... Thanks very much for the question. As Helen stressed, the AGEE framework is intended to be very flexible. So while we're going to be presenting information on the cross-national data, which has drawn on assembling SDG, mainly SDG indicators and other indicators, which Rosie and Kane will talk about in a minute when we give you examples. And we've done work on national dashboards, and we will be talking at the end of the workshop on that. We feel that the AGEE dashboard can be very helpful at a school level, at a neighborhood level, at a project level, and we've done work with the Girls Education Challenge on using the AGEE framework to supplement the monitoring and evaluation work associated with the projects that were part of the Girls Education Challenge program. And so we think partly it's a tool to think with. It allows you to see where data is missing. It allows you to engage with processes like the education sector plan or advocacy campaigns. So it's not just one thing. It's a process of thinking, looking, advocating, and trying to use data better. I hope that's responding to the sense of the question, Rasha.
Yes, it does perfectly. Another
yeah.
question asking, does AGEE conduct an international conference or workshop offline? What are the eligible criteria? Which countries are targeted for the AGEE project? And this is from Natia in Georgia. And another question is about how can, from Shukriya El Abdani, how can the education sector in crisis integrate gender in its response plan, like in cases of crisis and emergencies?
Yeah. So for all people who are interested in AGEE, we have, and we can put in the chat, and on the very last slide of this presentation is our website. You're very welcome to use all our materials, and we'll talk through some of the materials we've got. And we'd be very open to running workshops remotely, probably would be best if people are interested. And what we're very keen on is to build a community of practice around gender and education data. UIS convened a conference in Paris in February looking at better data, and there was a panel on gender. We'd really like to build out from these processes because yeah, so please contact us direct, and we would work with different organizations, and we hope you find our materials helpful. In relation to the education sector in crisis and conditions of conflict, we again think that AGEE is very flexible and could be used for mobile refugee populations, could help identify what it is we don't know and we need to know. So again, that's work and discussions we began with Education Cannot Wait, and again are very open to taking forward discussions on this. So the dashboard is a tool for you to use. And I think when Kane and Rosie start to present the material on the on what it is you see when you use our visualizations, you can see that it's very compelling how you see what there is and what there isn't, and where attention needs to focus. How are we doing on time, Russia? Is there time for another? Yes, we've got time for another round of questions. Helen, I don't know if you want to pick up the answers on the next round.
This is an interesting question from Bangladesh. from US Rukia after she's asking, does capability approach can collect the deep-rooted gender norms and related social factors those influence gender parity in education? Do you think so?
So I think what is analytically powerful for me about the analysis of the capability approach, and I think it's also been used very informatively in relation to other metrics, the UNDP measures, the SIGI measure, which is the social, looking at institutional basis of gender inequality, is that it draws our attention to the social relationships, the structures, the institutions that make it difficult to turn educational opportunities into productive, flourishing forms of education outcomes. Because if we only look at access and participation, you're not looking at the range of social relationships that might be different, that we know are different for people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, different identities. And it's that the capability approach, because it does focus on what are called conversion factors in the conceptual language that they use, I think it does focus on context in a very useful way for policy and planning.
There's another question on data. I mean, Angela Arnott from PNG, she's asking, the problem is that where there is severe gender disparities, such as in PNG, there is very limited data.
Yeah.
Old household data. I mean, so how do you deal with the scarcity of data in this regard? How does capability approach deal with this data vacuum?
So the capability approach is a way of thinking. The advocacy for data and the demand for data and the demand for governments and a whole range of institutions to be transparent about what they're doing. Those are social processes, and those have to come from within political, economic, and cultural processes within countries. There is a kind of global consensus on the need for better data, but data is very, very expensive to gather, and it needs to be done with care. It needs to be done with proper resourcing, and the challenges are not only collecting the data, but also using the data well in making analyses that can inform policy. So somebody asked me a few days ago, what have you learned in the AGEE project? And my answer was that I've learned that we've always got to go further. We've always got to go deeper. It's always a much more difficult process. When we initially had the idea, we thought data was just lying around like dust, like sand, and we could pick it up. We've learned exactly what the colleague from PNG is saying. It's difficult, and even countries that have got good data collection processes, they can't always process the data in ways that are usable by policymakers. So there's a huge mobilization in a way that we need to take this project forward. I think there might be time for one more question.
All right, for one more question from Mr. Bashir Al-Hamoudi, and he's asking whether gender equality in education is based on enrollment rates only. There's no diagnostic data as well. Back to data includes subpoints that clarify the limits and areas of gender parity and equity. And as well, another question is asking about the qualitative, going more for qualitative data collection rather than quantitative.
Yeah, thanks. So I think where we started off with the AGEE project was that the focus on data 20 years ago or 30 years ago was on enrollment rates. And then it was clear that enrollment rates didn't tell you anything about attendance and didn't tell you anything about learning outcomes. And a big effort has gone into improving data on school attendance and on learning outcomes. And you can see from the diagram Helen showed about the AGEE project that participation continues to be part of the AGEE framework. But I think now, as your participation in the word cloud showed, and as so many of the questions are raising, it's clear that participation in school can't be separated from an understanding of the social conditions that make for various forms of inequalities, and that we can't just address participation in school. We have to also look at the causes of the inequalities that lead to unjust exclusions from schooling and very unequal outcomes in different countries in the world. And that's what the AGEE framework is. Partly it's a sort of diagnostic, and partly it's a process of demanding more data in order to take forward those initiatives for change. So it's stepping off from the initial perception that counting number of enrollments was important, but we don't want to just stop at one thing. We want to create a much more informed view of how education sits in society and how society interacts, political, economic, and social processes interact with education, and use data wisely to promote change around equalities. Shall we pause? I know there are.
I think, yeah, because of time management, we should go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for selecting the questions for us, Rasha. I think we're passing now to Rosie and Kane, who are going to talk us through some of the examples from the cross-national dashboard.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Elaine, and hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you. So Kane and I are going to talk a little bit about some examples of a dashboard. So just to kind of, as a reminder of what we're presenting here, this is just what we've done so far on creating cross-national dashboards. But as Elaine and Helen had mentioned, it's possible to create similar dashboards at many different levels, whether that's local or project level and so on. The process for making these cross-national dashboards, we followed what Helen described earlier on. So we had a number of consultations at local, national and international levels with people working in the field of gender and education, numbers of different roles. We kind of, and so we were asking people about their understandings of what gender is, what gender equality in education is, what do they think need to be measured and so on. And we brought that together with insights from the capability approach, which again, as Helen mentioned, is this kind of theoretical, evaluative way of thinking about equality in a more substantive way. So we used both of those together and then developed some criteria around how to select which particular indicators. So these were things relating to the balance of types of data within each domain, and at the same time develop those 6 domains that Helena presented earlier on. After doing that, we then did for the cross-national data, we did a very thorough audit of what indicators, what data is actually available if you want to be creating dashboards that are comparable across countries. So this involved auditing many things like SDG indicators, but also thinking laterally and looking more broadly around other surveys that we might use, other sources of data that can be used to look across countries. And then finally, we selected indicators to use for this version of the cross-national dashboard. And again, there was a process of consultation with different groups around what was seen as appropriate. So what we're presenting today is based on that final list of indicators for each of the 6 domains for the cross-national dashboard. And it kind of, at this stage, we've actually been working with 6 spotlight countries, and we're only going to be presenting data from 2 of the spotlight countries today, Bangladesh and Indonesia. This kind of hopefully will give you a bit of a picture about how the dashboard is shaping up. And as you'll see from what we're presenting as well, it's been helpful, but also a little frustrating because we've realized how much missing data there is. And there are some sort of, even though some of the indicators, for example, we're taking from the SDG database, there are missing values for many countries. And it's been a very interesting exercise to kind of look at the reasons, look deeper and look at the reasons why some of those values aren't there for some of these key indicators. So that kind of fits in with the advocacy line that Helen and Elaine were talking about. And one of our key aims is, of course, to think about how to improve data and how thinking both sort of creatively and conceptually about what we want to be measuring here, and then bringing that together with kind of practical ideas about what steps, what can we use at the moment and what steps might be needed to get the sort of low-hanging fruit of data. So in the next few slides, we'll be presenting data from Bangladesh and Indonesia, obviously 2 very different countries with different histories and different economies, different education paths and so on. And we're not doing, I just want to emphasize, we're not doing a kind of comparative analysis or interpretation here, but we wanted to just put up some of these examples for you to see how the dashboard can be working. And especially to hear from you about what you think about this as a way of exploring the multifaceted nature of educational inequalities. So we'll talk, we're just going to go through each of the domains briefly and show some example data. So the first domain, which as Helen mentioned already, it's resources. So this was highlighted as important for education in many of our consultations. It's not the whole story about what is important in education and inequality, but these are still an important part of the gender education, an equitable gender education system. So the data that the variables we've been using for the cross-national at the moment, just partly because of what's available, relate to the ability to track gender finance and also the presence of single-sex toilets at different school levels, and then a balance of, so actually a gender ratio of teachers at different education levels. Kane, do you want to come in to talk a little bit about the... Is Kane here?
Sorry, thank you, Rosie.
Oh,
yes.
Sorry, Kane.
So just on this, for this sort of technical aspect, so that people can understand exactly how these things are calculated, the idea is that more gender equality is represented by a larger bar, and each of the variables is rescaled so that 100 would be the maximum amount of gender equality and 0 would be the minimum amount. So here, in respect to the fact that there are 5 indicators, the maximum score that a country can get on this domain would be 500. So you can see that actually Indonesia is doing quite well, a score of about 350, which indicates that on each of these variables, they are close to or getting close towards the maximum amount of gender equality. These are fairly rudimentary indicators, however. I would think that we might be able to add some more in the future. We've got some other candidate variables. These really just represent the availability of single-sex toilets and the equality of teachers at each of the levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary. So in order to get 100 here, you would have to have total equality between men and women in the teaching force. So for example, Indonesia here is getting a higher score than Bangladesh because it's got a greater level of equality in the teaching force at secondary and tertiary levels primarily. Can we show the next slide where we represent this, the same data in a slightly different way?
And just to add as well, actually, of course, one of the measures that we had on the previous slide, the gender finance tracking, we initially had included this, but I understand there's not a measure for Indonesia at the moment. So one decision we're having to make is if a country doesn't have a variable, how to whether to sort of impute something for that or not. And we're currently wondering whether or not we should score a country at 0 for not having the gender tracking measure, which is part of the SDGs. So those are the kind of decisions we're having to make. Just to give the next, the next diagram.
Yes, so I think you'll see in some of the future domains that there are more sophisticated measures than we have on resources. But on this one, the way that this graph works is that a country which had a circle or a line which was close to the outside of this circle would be reaching the maximum amount of equality on each of these variables. And so the radar graph is intended to show areas where a country could improve in order to improve its total score by getting closer to the outside. And so you can see that the orange line, which is Indonesia, is slightly wider than the blue line, which is Bangladesh, but they are actually performing better in different areas of gender equality with respect to resources. So again, the same point that, for example, on women teachers in tertiary and secondary, Indonesia is getting quite close to the outside, which means a high level of equality. However, on single-sex toilets in lower secondary school, Bangladesh is close to the equality mark, and so doing better in that area. So back to that question, I think that someone asked in the chat, how could it be used for policy? Well, it ought to be able to help us to think about what areas a country should prioritize in order to improve gender equality in respect of each one of these domains.
Thanks, Kane. So the values domain, we have a much larger number of candidate indicators here. So this is the example of some of them. And as Helen mentioned earlier on, the idea, the concept behind the values domain is to give a picture of the kind of the context of norms around gender that relate to sort of gender and education, or may affect girls and boys' experiences in education. So this includes provisions in constitutions. We've got something from the World Value Survey on views and attitudes towards men and women going to university, and then quite a range of different variables relating to legal measures and provisions around gender and education. So for the and I know that we were missing a couple of these, I think, for Indonesia and Bangladesh, so that may be why then they may not feature in this bar chart as well. And one of the dilemmas we have is whether to replace, what do we do if some of the complex measures around legal provisions, so some of the SDG indicators, for example, rely on the countries answering questionnaires with sort of 30 or 40 questions on the legal provisions around gender. And if that hasn't been completed by a country, when it's not necessarily easy to substitute something else in for that measure in the way that it might be for some of the other, more straightforward educational measures. So this is one of the dilemmas we're having at the moment, is whether to swap things in.
Nonetheless, it is quite complete for these two countries in this domain. And I think maybe it helps to answer some of the questions that are coming up, like, for example, what are the factors which may promote or otherwise gender equality in the countries Indonesia and Bangladesh? Well, it's not an in-depth qualitative study which would look at the cultures and histories of these countries. It's just at this point a set of indicators which we can use, but behind those indicators are all sorts of phenomena, subjective and objective phenomena. So the last one here, we've got women's access to higher education. The views on women's access, which is taken from a World Values Survey, which is conducted in a large number of countries, that is subjective. So that's telling us about what people think. And the question there is specifically about whether women should have equal access, whether women are an equal priority in higher education. And actually, both countries don't score particularly well on that, which means that not a high proportion of people felt that it was of an equal priority for men and women to access higher education. However, on many of the conventions and the international bills of rights and so on, both countries have actually signed them. So the maximum score here would be 1,000, and both countries are, I would say, doing better than many countries in similar economic circumstances there.
Thanks, Kane. That's the...
This represents the same thing. And again, the orange line closer to the outside. It's right on the outside when it comes to signing particular agreements, the Convention Against Discrimination in Education, for example, because that's either a yes or no. So if a country has signed it, they get 100 for that, and they're point on the circle would be right on the outside. If they haven't signed it, it will be 0. So that's why you get a slightly strange shape for some of these dimensions. But actually, on the values, I mean, again, I think it's useful to understand that a country might do quite well on values and not very well on resources, or not very well on, for example, opportunities, even though it does well on values, because simply signing a set of agreements doesn't necessarily mean that those have been implemented in practice. So that's why the domains will give us a different picture on some of similar concepts, which is quite useful.
Thanks, Kane. So the opportunities domain is the next one. There's quite a lot of candidate indicators in this one. The thinking behind this domain is to sort of give a sense of the economic and social context, which is often closely related to the sort of policy environment as well. And as Lane was saying, this sort of relates to the concept of conversion factors. For those of you familiar with the capability approaches, the sort of things that might determine whether individuals are able to access resources. So this covers a range of sort of things that are meant to relate to the opportunities that people may or may not have, and whether there's a gender difference in those sorts of opportunities. So you can see there's 2 lists of those here. We're kind of looking both at things relating to health, internet use, and so on. And this is how, so this is how the 2 countries sort of shape up. I'm just looking to see if there's any information on the missing data as well. I know that I think actually the only
all here for this one, actually, it's quite good, quite complete.
Yes, I think it's quite complete. And so the child labour, which measure, which was one that we were taking from the the SDGs, we didn't have a value for Indonesia, but we've imputed something else from another study that seemed to be representative.
And to understand how these are calculated, again, remember that 100 would be the maximum. So for the child labour GPI, if there was total equality in child labour, that means equal numbers of boys and girls employed in child labour, then you would get 100. So the bar would be wide. But of course, that's neutral on the question of whether or not child labour is something that should be eliminated. Our question there is only about equality in child labour. So I think that's something that we're also thinking about, whether or not we could adjust these figures for phenomena which we might think are undesirable. So if child labour is undesirable, that's separate from the question of whether or not it's equally affecting boys and girls. So that's another thing for us to discuss. And I think there are a lot of questions coming up in the chat about some of the nuances here. Like, for example, does just having equal numbers of men and women as teachers in tertiary education or primary education necessarily address gender imbalances? It's not the whole story, and each one of these indicators is only telling a partial story, and there's always something behind that. So, we are aware of those limitations, and I think it's very useful to get these comments and understand how, in different contexts, having more women teachers might be more or less supportive of gender advancement for girls in school, because that depends on much other wider features of the system. Any other comments on these ones, Rosie? Because okay. So back to this. This one is on participation. Sorry, opportunities in gender equality. So a messy picture here, because these things are quite distinct. So we've got endorsement of safe schools, which is a particular declaration, but we've also got things like intimate partner violence, which is very different and measured in a very different way from a sample survey. So I think it's a complex picture, but the 2 countries there, doing better and worse in slightly different areas, depending on, for example, child marriage, what laws have been enacted. Child labour is a more factual question about that. You can see that there in Bangladesh, there is a big gap between what boys and girls are doing in child labour, a smaller gap in Indonesia. Stunting, I mean, that tells us really about whether or not girls and boys are equally affected by the phenomenon of stunting, which is about nutrition. And actually in both countries there, the figure is close to 100, which means that stunting affects boys and girls equally.
Thanks, Kane. I'm aware of, I think it's quite good that we just go through the different domains, but I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting discussion points. So the next domain is participation, and this is one, I suppose, where traditionally a lot of education mainstream gender equality indicators that are used will come from this and the knowledge domain as well. We've obviously here included quite a few of the traditional measures around access and completion, but we're also trying to get a sense of gender across a broader area of participation. So we're trying to include information on technical and vocational education, and also things like if there's significant gender differences in the experiences of bullying. So, you know, it's interesting to see, for example, whether there are more girls than boys or more boys than girls experiencing bullying within school. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do here, is kind of look at participation, but get a broader range of factors that might be playing into and affecting gender differences in participation. And I think we don't have any, for these two countries, we didn't actually have any missing data at the moment. Some of these are built on SDG indicators, but as I said, some of them are coming from other types of surveys as well.
And these are all, again, pretty much gender parity indices. So 100 is total equality, 0 is inequality. Some of those are slightly different, like the experience of bullying, but again, it's a gender parity index, even though it's a subjective question. So the question is, do boys and girls experience bullying equally? And that is slightly more the case in Indonesia than in Bangladesh. But actually, both countries have got similar scores overall on this participation domain. And I think maybe this relates to the point that Elaine made, that in the past there was a great emphasis on participation and enrollment rates, and there has been a lot of progress towards equality in those kinds of measurements. So we see also greater equality on our indicators in this area, which has probably received more attention than others.
Spain.
And then again, you know, both countries a bit closer to the outside on this domain than on some of the others, although less so perhaps on, for example, the Gender Parity Index on participation in technical and vocational education. So that's something where there is a gap, certainly in Bangladesh, between men and women, and a bit less, I think, on higher education, a bit less equality there than on primary and secondary, which again is something you might expect as countries develop their education systems. It will take time to feed through equality from the primary and secondary into the later stages of education.
Thanks, Kane. Then the knowledge domain, kind of as with participation, we're aware that there are many sort of traditional education measures relating to knowledge, and we're, as much as possible, we really want to get a broader sense of knowledge. So learning across all areas of the curriculum, not just measured in relation to literacy and numeracy, ideally. And you know, we would really like this to include things like, what do people learn around values relating to rights and gender equality, and also information on other forms of teaching, the forms of teaching and learning that are taking place. Some of these, as some of you may be aware, is in SDG indicator 4.7. There is the intention that this data is going to be collected at the kind of cross-national level, but at the moment, what the actual data being collected is quite restrained and not yet what we would like it to be. So there's a kind of aspiration around this domain in particular. I suppose we're not quite able to at the moment, but we're still trying to include some of the more basic measures relating to knowledge, but also we've got so formal training for adults, and whether there's gender difference in the levels of that, so kind of adult education indicator. And then interesting to look at the gender balance in people taking STEM subjects. I think that's just at the higher education level at the moment. It would be really interesting if we could get that for other levels of education, for secondary as well. But at the moment, it's not possible. As we said, though, you know, these, if you were doing a dashboard like this, but at the national level or even at the local or regional level, it might be that there are more indicators available that could be drawn on to create a kind of more a richer dashboard as well. Many of the constraints that we've got here, we're trying to select indicators that will be present across a number of different countries. And I think we've had to miss one off here. Is that right? We've missed off, what is it? Partly because I think there wasn't it's the training, the adult education. I think there wasn't a measure for Bangladesh at the moment, so we've left it off these charts for the time being. but that's something that I think we should be able to have a value to put in some way in future. Yeah, so it looks like, you know, in some ways the scores are fairly similar between the countries. I don't know, would you say that, Kane? And yeah, so you know, the radar. Yeah, sorry, Kane.
Sorry, Rosie, I couldn't unmute. Yes, that's right. So there's more similarity here between the two countries, but I think there are certain areas where there's definitely less equality overall. And I think one of those is the STEM subjects. So in both countries, there is a high degree of inequality in access to STEM subjects at university, more so in Bangladesh, but nonetheless, both countries. However, on the harmonized test scores, both countries are quite close to having equality, which means that at the age, I think, of 15, when these are measured, there isn't a significant difference really between boys and girls test scores. And that's more so in Bangladesh, very similar test scores between boys and girls, very similar literacy rates at age of 15. But then after that, in STEM, they're going into different subjects and they're having different levels of access to training for youth and adults. And again, particularly in Bangladesh, which is similar to our point about TVET in the last slide.
Thanks, Kane. And then the last domain, so outcomes, and educational outcomes are often discussed in relation to gender equality. And I think we similar to the last few domains, we kind of wanted to try and take a broader perspective and think about what sorts of things might be related to the level of the gendered experiences within school and the different types of educational experiences that men and women and boys and girls might be having. These aren't obviously linked to the particular ones in the previous slides directly, but I mean numerically, but we felt that for the dashboard especially, it's important to have a picture of gender equality in wider society to kind of also inform the picture. So we've chosen some of the indicators that might give a picture of how capabilities between men and women differ in a range of different experiences. So here we've got something about levels of poverty and differences between men and women. Yes, the proportion of time spent on unpaid domestic and care work, which is an SDG indicator. It's quite patchy in terms of what data we've got on it, but it's, I think, a really, really interesting one for us to consider. A more traditional one, the labour force participation rate, and also the numbers of seats held in national parliament by women. Those two are quite typical ones, often discussed in relation to education. And then there's one from the SDGs about the ability to make informed choices relating to sexual and reproductive health. And this is something where there isn't data available for all countries, but we're going to try and get some kind of measure it for different countries. So yes, these are the measures for the two countries.
And these are not specifically, as you said, not specifically about education, but these are areas where we think education or gender equality in education might contribute to broader gender equality in society. And as you can see here, both countries are quite low on the proportion of parliamentary seats held by women, so in political equality terms. But both countries are quite high on gender parity of people employed in poverty. So men and women similarly likely to be employed in poverty. Again, not necessarily a good thing, but it's an equal thing in relative terms by gender. And then the labour force participation rate, probably a very important indicator of gender equality in society, where Bangladesh seems to be doing slightly better than Indonesia. But again, as people are commenting in the chat, there are so many nuances here because gender parity in employment in one sector will be very different compared to another, let's say informal versus formal employment and so on. And so there are many ways in which you could dig into this data in individual countries that would give you a more sophisticated picture of what's going on if that data is available. And a lot of the other questions that are coming up are about data availability, and that is our biggest limitation. We can only include variables which there are data for a significant number of countries, and as it happens, that just doesn't cover everything. But for some countries, you can go into a lot more detail.
Thanks, Kane. Yeah, it's a really important points about the nuances, and again, you know, things like the parliamentary seats held by women is a very blunt measure of women's political participation. It's usually blunt, and we're very aware of these limitations. And I suppose part of what we want to be doing is encouraging debate and thinking about what else would we need to collect. And as I said before, it might be possible to use more nuanced measures if this was only done at the local or a more focused national report as well, which would be really interesting to do. But yes, it's been very interesting for us to have this challenge of trying to bridge between what are blunt measures, but trying to still create something that's better than what's gone before, and somehow gives a bit more of a nuanced picture of the overall snapshot of gender and education. This is the radar diagram for the outcomes, which...
By the way, on that first indicator, we should have said the full definition, which is the proportion of women who make informed decisions about sexual and reproductive health, I think.
Yes, that's right. It's there on the last one, the bottom one of this slide. So yes, and it is actually an SDG indicator, and data coverage isn't great at the moment, but it should be improving. So it's an interesting one that's moving forwards, I think.
And there, I think you could say, room for improvement for both countries. And perhaps sometimes I think, I don't know if you agree, Rosie, that in most countries, there's probably more equality in the education system than there is in other areas outside of it, like, for example, the labour market and some of these other domains. Certainly politics seems to be an area in most countries where there is greater inequality than there is perhaps in education. And I think that's an interesting line of inquiry for us to take. To what extent does the Gender Equality in Education Index provide predictive power about other sectors of society? Are they very distinct, or are they closely related?
Well, yes, exactly. Yeah.
Go on, sorry.
Exactly, Ken. And I think that puzzle is one of the things that I suppose drove us forwards, I suppose, to try and want to get more information about what goes on in education, because there are some really interesting cases in many countries where, according to the more traditional measures of gender equality in education, it may seem that girls are doing as well as boys, or if not even better in terms of attendance or participation. And then this may not be sort of coming through in terms of what's happened in the labour market in the last 20 years or so. I think at the moment at the cross-national level, we are limited, as Kane said, in the data that we can get to give a more nuanced picture of the gendered processes and the different forms of inequality that occur in educational spaces. But we really do want to encourage debate, I guess, and to hear from people about what other data needs to be collected to help us give more of a picture. And of course, what happens in education is not the only determining factor of the outcomes in wider society. But it's, I think, important to get more of a picture about what's going on.
If we look, for example, Rosie, at that GPI of time spent on unpaid work, I mean, that's an interesting one. So Indonesia is showing that there's almost equality, almost total equality between men and women on the time spent in unpaid work, whereas in Bangladesh, there's very low level of equality. But the nuance behind that is probably quite complex. So what kinds of work is it that men and women are doing, and how is it counted, and how do people respond to that question in those two countries? I suspect in reality, the gap is not as big as that between those two countries, but culturally, there are different kinds of ways in which work is assigned.
Yes, and I think for that measure, if I'm right in remembering, we've had to impute the data from a different kind of, so it's not necessarily measured in exactly the same way. They are both measures of some form of unpaid work, but that's an example of how we'd need to kind of look, as you said, more closely at the nuances of exactly that. I wonder if we should move. I'm aware of time very much. This is the last slide, which kind of is comparing across 5 of the domains at the moment. I think this is partly because we're discussing doing a composite indicator which wouldn't include the outcomes as well as part of that. Is that right, Kane?
The reason is here that if we add the outcomes as well, I think it can be a bit confusing because the outcomes aren't about education specifically. So this represents the equality domains in education rather than what that might lead to in broader society. And so here again, total equality would be an orange or blue line all the way around the edge. Total inequality would be a dot in the middle. So both countries are somewhere in between. And actually not massively different, I guess, but with Indonesia doing slightly better on all of those domains, but with some variation. So I think the weakest area for Indonesia, if you look at it that way, might be the knowledge domain. There's more inequality in the knowledge domain in Indonesia than elsewhere. But again, making that kind of comparison has to be done in a very sort of careful way because it's only based on a small number of indicators. But I think presented in that way with all that nuance, it's complex, but it really does then help to unpack how these numbers are created and what they can be interpreted for, and how they can be used then to guide areas of policy or areas of focus, what needs to be improved and what are the areas that are the greatest challenge to improve. Some of these things will require a lot of resources, some wouldn't, for example.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually looking at the diagrams. They're kind of almost similar shapes, even though they have different sizes. So that, yeah, it's interesting thing, different ways of presenting the data. We've just got one slide to finish off, I think, which is, I suppose, about thinking about. I mean, we're very aware. We're hugely aware of the limitations of the dashboard, and what we've presented today is very much the sort of first draft of what we've been doing on these two countries, and that there is missing data, and of course a huge number of qualifications and nuances relating to each of the indicators. And you know, even if we did have data across all the countries that we're looking at, which we don't at the moment, it is a very blunt model, and it's definitely not a direct measure of capabilities in and through education. But we are kind of trying to use this, even though it is a blunt measure, to kind of give more insight into the different pathways that may have that have, you know, why gender equality is at the current state that it is in different countries, and as Kane said, maybe can suggest more tailored policy responses. So trying to have more nuanced discussions around the different areas that may need attention in different countries. And equally importantly, though, is that I suppose we want this to be able to be used for lobbying for different kinds of data collection and future improvements moving forwards. And particularly through using this dashboard as a way to identify gaps, we can maybe think about identifying what is the kind of low-hanging fruit, or what sources of data are nearly available but not quite usable at the moment, that might just need a certain amount of resource input or a certain amount of lobbying, strategic lobbying, to get data into the public sphere so that it could be used. And in line with that, it's very interesting to think about, like, how is data important in accountability, which is, of course, as Elaine was saying at the beginning, one of our key concerns with this project is that it's ideal if data isn't just a kind of something that's used as in a top-down way, but that it's something that different groups can be involved in discussions about, and especially local groups who may want to have really important insights about what gender and education issues there are and what information needs to be gathered, and having access to data that can be used to hold people in authority and organisations to account for what's being provided at the local level.
In that sense, I think it's a starting point, isn't it, for many other activities? That's where it's most useful. It draws attention in a comparative way to a wide range of data, and then raises a lot of questions, but it doesn't provide all the answers to those. For example, in India, the participation rate of women in the labour market has been falling in recent years, which is not something you'd necessarily expect, but we can't answer why that is. But we would be able to include that in our indicator, and it would be then an area that would be highlighted as an issue potentially, but it doesn't help you to understand all the forces behind it. That's another kind of work, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Kane. I'm really aware of time. Should we move on to the, because I think the next slide is do we have any time for some questions? Sorry, Rasha, I'm sure that
there are many burning questions, but I'm happy that many of the questions have been answered on the chat by Kane and Christine on the spot. But we can take a couple of questions if time would allow it. The issue of female leadership has come in many questions. So have you looked into the indicators on women in school leadership as being principals in the position? And as well, this question has come from Egin and Angela. And as well, Bashir has reiterated is that there is a UNESCO report indicating that the best schools are the school run with a which is led by female principals. So have you looked into the female leadership components?
Yes, we and it for a while was one that we were really hoping to include. Thank you for the question, and it's a really important issue. We were hoping to include it. At the moment for the cross-national data, it's not there in at a level that we can use it across enough countries. However, for national level studies, local level studies. I think in many countries there is that data available, and so absolutely, I think it would be super interesting to use that and important. And it's a great example of trying to think about what other measures might give an indication of how gender works within institutions, within educational institutions. So thank you. Yes, yeah. I hope we can use it soon.
Another question by Ghada Sawadik. She's wondering about qualitative data that would explain the results and the reasons and the root causes of inequities. So the highlighting education, women choosing not to work for a variety of reasons, or if you've mentioned something about STEM education, about where like female teachers teaching science and math, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, also really important questions. So this data that we're doing for the spotlight countries, it's going to be accompanied by, and as Kane mentioned as well, the need for qualitative discussion and insights of what we've presented here in a very blunt manner is very important. And we'll be writing sort of policy briefs to go with the spotlight data that we've been presenting. Kane, I don't know if you wanted to also come in there.
No, I agree. I think that's exactly right. It's a diagnostic tool more than an answer to all those questions, but it does really stimulate the debate in a way that you couldn't have the same level of debate without this evidence. I think that's what it's really useful for.
Yeah, I think we can move forward, and then more answers would come on the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasha. I think is Elaine or Helen, are you?
I think we might move straight on to the kind of practical element of the workshop now. But just to invite people, so we've mentioned a little bit about the next phase of work that we're going to be doing on AGEE, which has been funded by KIX and GPE. And we do invite you to stay in touch if you're interested in keeping abreast of the work that we're doing on the project. So please keep in touch, and do keep an eye on our project website, which we give the address for at the end of this workshop. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to Elaine now so that we've got time for you to get more information around kind of doing a AGEE, or involving using the AGEE process. Elaine.
Thanks, Helen. So as Helen was mentioning, the next phase of our work, this Bridging AGEE project, which will be looking at the relationship between local level AGEE dashboards, national level and the global level, and trying to think about some of the questions people have been posing in the chat about how we draw on qualitative data and how we draw on issues around disability or specific groups that are discriminated against in particular contexts. We're wanting to look at how what the process is about connecting discussion on those themes. But if I move now to the last part of the workshop, which is really about what we learned from working on the cross-national work which Rosie and Kane have presented to you. And I think you saw that putting those data together allows you to ask specific questions, and they're questions both of what we know and what we don't know, and what's the quality of the data we have. And these insights from the cross-national dashboard, I think, are particularly, or I hope will be helpful to you if you were thinking of building national dashboards for the countries in which you work at, because the cross-national dashboard, which Rosie and Kane were producing, is drawing on SDG indicators and global databases, because we have to be able to compare apples and apples and apples across all those different countries. But in national settings, I think there's a lot more flexibility and a lot more potential to draw on wide data sensors. So on this slide, I've just summarized some of the issues that we have learned ourselves through the process of doing national dashboard work in South Africa and Malawi. Key to the whole process is a consultative process, consulting on why you might do a national dashboard, who you're going to involve in that process, and in setting the criteria for including particular indicators. So we want to stress, and I think we've all been saying it in different ways, that we think of AGEE as a process as much as a product. As useful and illuminating as those radar diagrams and bar charts are, I think the process of discussion and the process of who you bring to the table and whose critical voices you engage with is a really important part of the AGEE package. And I think it's what we hope will enable better, more responsive data and better, more responsive policy and planning and practice. So we recommend including in the national AGEE workshops policymakers, practitioners, and campaigners together, aware that that's quite a difficult mixture of people, and there might be some very sharp disagreements between different groups, and somehow building the atmosphere in the national workshop so that groups can listen to each other respectfully and think about where the areas of disagreement are and what is it they can agree on and what is it might be areas to park. But that process of thinking about the gender and education indicators together has been very fruitful for us. And the other issue that we've become aware of is that a lot of statistics describes the world as it is. It describes, in a way, many of the features of inequalities in the world that we have and that we're aware of. It's a much harder task to start to think about indicators about a world that we want to be. So I know one of the early questions posed in the chat was about what are you doing about disability? And at the moment, we don't have, on the cross-national dashboard, you can see there wasn't an indicator about disability. There might indeed be on a national dashboard or a local dashboard, an indicator about disability because you have a policy around inclusion or you're thinking about inclusion in a particular way. Within national dashboards and in local dashboards, I think people should use the space, or what has been helpful in the discussions we'd held is to go beyond aggregation. Often in reporting to a cross-national survey, a cross-national requirement for information, disaggregation is very, very broad brushstroke. The example Helen gave of the wide database, we can compare rural and urban, we can compare between various socioeconomic groups. It's very difficult to do intersectionality between those different groups and the kind of nuance. But on a national dashboard, there might be opportunities for going beyond disaggregation and thinking about that in very productive ways. And then to think about gender responsive and gender transformative indicators, indicators that would give us a sign that we were starting to dismantle some of those institutions or structures or relationships that are causing gender inequality, because I think so far we've documented forms of gender inequality and we've been less good at being able to address through data the causes of gender inequality. But we think a national dashboard would be one space to work on that. On the next slide is some hints about what to do if you were planning a participatory workshop to develop a national agenda. There are recommendations here of who to have at the table: representatives from the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Gender and Women Affairs, national statistical officers, academics with expertise in gender, women's rights and education, and civil society and advocacy groups. Those are the absolute core. You can build out from that, but those seem to be the groups that seem to be central to us. It's important to take account of where this consultative workshop might come in a planning cycle. Is it close to drawing up the education sector plan? Is it at the end of an education sector plan? Where are you on SDG reporting? There are a whole range of issues. Where are you in relation to the election cycle? There are a whole range of issues that will feed into the timing for the workshop. We think it's important to be attentive to those, because those will set the flavor of the aims of what the national dashboard is trying to be. There's on the next slide, I'll show you an agenda template. This is an agenda template, and you can look at the reports of our workshops in Malawi and South Africa at the agenda and the aims. If we go back to the previous slide, Rosie. We have a list of documents that you can prepare: draft aims, draft criteria, because people need to come to the workshop having done a bit of work. It's a very, very intense process to spend the day in a national dashboard meeting. But the more you prepare and the more the documents are written for people to engage with, the better. And then we suggest building out from the indicators that once you have the draft criteria, you can build out from the draft indicators on the cross-national dashboard, and then build in ones that are nationally relevant. So the ones that have been, the question about head teachers in leadership positions or policies around disability, all of that could be built in as indicators, but we have a kind of skeleton that you could build out with, and you can subtract or add, but we hope it's a resource that you could use. And then we think that the end of the national planning meeting should have a next steps template and time frame. And thinking about missing data is that, Rosie, I think there's a next step slide, 2 slides on. Yeah, this is draft next steps to be used in closing affair. So thinking about a validation process for the national dashboard, thinking about validating the criteria to be used, thinking about a team to lead the process of selecting the data, training and materials, looking at if there are important missing data, how would you advocate for those data? Where's the funding? And there's the reporting. So there's a whole cycle of a process that has already been started in some countries that we hope you could build on. So on the next slide, which is a Padlet, Rosie, could you just lead the discussion on this one?
Yes, the idea, so we've got, I think 6 different questions, and we would love to hear from you. I know that time is short for the end of the workshop, but if you haven't used Padlet before, I think you can either use the QR code there, or is there a link that people will go in the chat as well, I think? And
Yes.
when it takes you to the page, under each question, so you can see the questions numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. So these are questions relating to both how is education and gender data already collected by your organisation, but also we would love to hear from you on what you think should be collected and what is missing and so on. So there's a range of questions about moving forward. Please click on the plus sign, which is being very helpfully circled there. And that will open up a little sort of sticky note for you to write your answer on. And as I understand it, those writing in Russian and Arabic will have their answers translated, I think. And then you have to submit. So once you've written your comment, there's a little button to press for submit, and then it will post it up. And so ideally, we'll have a nice sort of wall of comments and thoughts for people to share.
Thanks, Rosie. So while people are doing that, which is in a way setting an agenda and reflections for work I hope we might be able to do with KIX going forward, is probably some rounding up thoughts from us. One of our some of our main concerns have been to connect with this important group of practitioners who've attended. We're really bowled over by having the chance to speak to such a wide group of people and with such interesting and engaged critical comments. Can I just ask, will we see the Padlet wall emerging? Is it going to start to emerge? Yes, I'm starting to see it. So,
Elaine,
I mean,
suggest,
we're particularly interested in the data on gender and education you think should be collected and some of the challenges. I think there's some comments in Russian and Arabic. It would be great to hear from Veronica and Yasmina. About data on gender and education, those entries under question 2 and 3 in Russian and Arabic. Could we, Veronica and Yasmina, I know we're short of time. I don't know if you wanted to give us a flavor.
I don't see any messages in Russian yet.
Same in Arabic as well.
And what challenges do you face around missing data? That one there? Oh, that's the translation? Sorry.
Yes, it's simply a translation.
Sorry. Yes.
No worries.
That's
we have an answer for the first question.
yes.
On the enrollment rates for the girls and for the boys also in the schools.
Yep. So it's clear that enrollment data is what's largely being collected, and people are stressing completion rates. The people are talking about barriers for advocacy. I guess we should look under question 3 and 4.
For the question 2, we have an answer. It's street children, trainees for education, girls, people with disabilities.
Okay. And if we look at 4 and 5, we're not training. Yeah. This is a lot of to be asking from you after a 2-hour workshop, but maybe again, if we go to the next, could we just go to the next slide for now and then maybe come back to this in a minute? This last slide, Rosie, is the AGEE website, isn't it? Yeah. Please get in touch with us through the AGEE website. We'd be we will look at the responses to the Padlet issues because I think we might want to write a blog engaging with some of the issues about what you think some of the problems around missing data and how they can be addressed. I think we are probably going to have to start to wrap up, and I will pass on for closing. But Russia, any last burning Q&A that you think I should spend the last 2 minutes on?
Yeah, Elaine, I believe with this website and email, I mean, you'd be receiving more questions and more communication later on to your direct website and your direct email. And I would hand over now to Marina.
Thanks very much, Russia. And thanks to all the AGEE team for their participation. But Marina, to you.
Thank you very much. Let me also suggest before the closing remarks that we will keep the Padlet open. So for all participants, if you'd like to still contribute to the Padlet exercise and also see other responses that are coming, we'll still keep it open for the coming days. So you can take your time to include some reflections there as well on your context. So it's my time to give some closing remarks for us. And I would like to start by thanking our instructors today, Elaine, Helen, Rosie, and Kane. I think this was a fantastic learning experience for all of us. And it really shows all the interest that is there in exploring further the AGE framework and in discussing as well the various challenges with accessing data, also the different dynamics between the global data and the national data and the possibilities we have as well in those two dimensions and in addressing the more nuances in the national context through the framework that the AGE is providing. We had a lot of engagements in the chat, a lot of interesting comments, discussions, reflections on what participants all over the regions that we are working on think that is relevant for their context, gaps they are seeing, but also the value they're seeing in the type of data that is coming out of these. So I think it's just the beginning of these engagements. And with the email that you have shared and also the website, I think we have a lot of interest from participants, and we encourage you to continue engaging with the work that the AGE team is doing, to keep following what is coming, because there's more coming out of it, and to keep engaging also in seeing how you can also produce and be engaged in the production of national dashboards for your context, and getting some of that useful data for policy changes regarding gender equality in your context. So with that, thank you once again to all of our instructors. As I said, our journey does not stop here. We'll continue engaging, seeking spaces for engaging with the AGE projects, especially with the KIX KIX research project that is starting. So we'll continue having that opportunity to learn from what is coming out of that, and we'll keep all the participants informed on that as well. And in the EMAP Hub in general, our discussion on gender equality for sure doesn't stop here. And we have already another event planned on a related topic, which is our KIX EMAP Webinar 19, Advancing Gender Equity and Social Inclusion, Evidence-Based Education Research in South Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. So this webinar is particularly focused in the countries in that region, South Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. And the webinar is planned for March 27, that is next Wednesday. And I encourage all of the participants here interested in the topic to join the webinar and learn more about real-world examples of innovations in the countries and how they can contribute to strengthening different aspects of an education system, and especially impact gender equity and social inclusion in the contexts that are being addressed. So as my colleagues to include the link of, it's there already, the link for webinar 19, you can read more about it and register as well. And we look forward to seeing you next week, next Wednesday. And lastly, as always, we ask that you share with us the feedback on this webinar. I have my colleagues including also a link to our post-event survey, and we'll be happy to learn from you both on your feedback, on what you took away from this session, suggestions that you have, but also how would you like to continue engaging with this topic? What types of activities, what formats would you like the hub to organize itself, to continue the discussion in this topic. So with that, let me close it here and thank you again to all the participants for their engagement in the chats and to all our amazing instructors today.